Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for everyone to coming here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about food and agriculture and what's happening on the land. But it has a lot of linkages to what Kevin was saying around also understanding some of the causes of human health problems and environmental problems. And what we do, I help run SLM Partners, which is an investment management firm. We use investment capital to help scale up more ecological, regenerative farming and forestry systems. We manage a fund in Australia, which has acquired over 1 million acres of land and is implementing a form of rotational grazing to restore grasslands. We're also working on projects in Chile, an Irish forestry fund, and developing an organic farming fund strategy in the USA as well. I'm going to start with a little bit with the bleak message, because I think this is the context in which we operate, but that's not actually going to be the tone of my talk, as you will find out. If you look at agriculture, and Jessica touched on this a little bit as well, there's a lot of environmental problems associated with our conventional agricultural system. Whether it's impacts on water quality, whether it's carbon emissions, destruction of biodiversity, use of pesticides and impacts on health, and fundamentally soil erosion. It's often said that the only thing that keeps us going as a species is 6 inches of topsoil in the fact it rains, and the problem is we're losing a lot of that topsoil at the moment. And this is just an example of Kenya, one of the sort of starker examples you could find. But also, echoing something Kevin said, we sometimes like to sit in wealthy developed countries and sort of assume all the problems are in developing countries, or sort of poor countries, and we're there to solve them. But actually, if you look much closer to home in Iowa, there's some alarming rates of soil erosion happening right here. And this is a picture of what happened in spring 2013 after a drought, when there were some quite heavy rains, and scientists were recording erosion rates of 8 tons per acre in a matter of a few days. So Iowa's lost half its topsoil over the last 150 years. Now, they're lucky because they got about 20 or 30 feet of topsoil, but eventually that will run out, and not all parts of the world have that resource to rely on. As I said, I'm not going to be pessimistic, actually, because we're actually extremely optimistic about the potential to turn around some of these problems. And from my point of view, sustainable agriculture isn't enough, because why would you want to sustain something which is destroying the planet at the moment? Instead, we think the opportunity and the need is for what we call regenerative agriculture. And so farming systems which are going to not just stop the deterioration, but actually actively regenerate the health of land. And how do you do it? Well, there's a few principles involved in these kinds of farming systems that we think have so much potential. They focus on soil health and soil biology. That's the starting point of these systems. They tend to minimize external inputs, so trying to use less synthetic fertilizers, less pesticides, and instead using the natural processes, and whether that's nitrogen fixation from the air by planting of legumes and cover crops, or the integration of compost and manure and the recycling of wastes, which gets to a broader point about they really try and aim for closed loop systems as much as possible. So where there should be no such thing as waste, whether that's food, whether it's energy, whether it's nutrients. There's a value in all those things we should try and capture. And the only input then becomes the sun, the energy from the sun, which is an infinite and inexhaustible resource, at least for the next few billion years. Another principle of these farming systems, they tend to really embrace diversity. So instead of having monocultures of corn, soybeans, corn, instead looking to have more diverse rotations, to integrate crops with animals, to integrate permanent crops, trees, in the landscape, effectively mimicking nature. You'll never see a monoculture in nature. There's always diversity, and that's what gives you resilience and production. And the farming system try and do that. And just the final point is around trying to grow healthy, nutritious food. And Kevin touched on this as well, about a lot of the healthcare industry is great at talking about and trying to tackle symptoms, but doesn't always address the root causes of poor health. Water quality is one, but the other is poor food quality. And I think Jessa mentioned a statistic that 795 million people are undernourished, but actually there's more than 1 billion people in the world who are obese or overweight. And suffering from very, very poor diet. And so the issue here is not just about food availability, but the quality of that food and the nutritional density of that food. And these kinds of systems tend to deliver that. Just a couple of examples of what can be achieved by different regenerative agricultural systems. This is a fantastic project in the lowest plateau in China. And that was a thoroughly degraded landscape, if you go back about 20 years ago, caused by overgrazing and overtilling and deforestation. And there's been a big effort for the last 20 years to turn it around by using terracing, by planting multiple crops, by controlling grazing. And it's just staggering what's happened. And they've been able to completely restore this landscape and turn it from kind of brown to green. A project we're working on in Patagonia in Chile at the moment. Here's an example of two sheep farms in Patagonia. And you can see the one on the right doesn't look very good. You know, the grass has been eaten away, the soil is degraded. And the one on the left, you can see, is a much healthier condition. And you have grass plants, you have more biodiversity. And what's interesting is there's sheep on both, but there's actually twice as many sheep on the one on the left as the one on the right. Okay, and the way in which you can achieve those improvements is by changing grazing practices. So going from a system where you have sheep scattered around, never moving, sort of undermanaged, to actually putting them in mobs, rotational grazing, trying to mimic nature, mimic behavior, for example, the bison, you know, in the North American plains, where you have big herds of animals moving through a landscape, having an impact, eating, then moving away. And you're trying to replicate that in a commercial livestock environment. And if you do it, you can achieve some great results. Another example, Gabe Brown is one of the most fantastic farmers in the US at the moment. He farms about 6,000 acres in North Dakota, and he uses diverse crop rotations, he uses cover crops, no tillage, he integrates livestock grazing. He's achieved incredible results over the last 20 years. And one of the things he's done is increase the amount of carbon in his soils. You know, so he's brought his soil organic matter levels from around 1.8% up to about 6.5%. You know, in a 15, 16-year period. That's extraordinary increases. And we often hear of agriculture as a big contributor to climate change, you know, as a problem, and it is, but can also be part of the solution, you know, because there's 3 times more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere. And there used to be probably 4 times, but we've lost a lot from the soil to the atmosphere. But we can turn that back, and we can use carbon farming to try and suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, put it in the soil where it belongs. And that's incredibly exciting. But you might say, well, that's all very well, nice sustainability story, environmental story, but can you actually produce, can you make any money out of it? And this is what's the most exciting part. We think that these regenerative systems are not only as productive and better for the environment, but they're often more profitable. And if you look at the case of organic farming at the moment in the USA, there's been a ton of studies in this, and the results are completely consistent, whether it's from USDA, whether it's from Iowa State or Rodale. You know, they're showing these rotations delivering net profits per acre on an organic system around $300 per acre, whereas a conventional farmer might get, you know, 100, maybe 80. And if you look just at 1 year in 2015 from the University of Minnesota, conventional corn growers were losing money because of low corn prices, whereas the organic growers are making $600 an acre. So there's no doubt that you can make more money, you know, by farming in this way. I think, and there's a broader question here, a broader topic, just to sort of touch on, because I know this conference is about conservation, you know, and that's the big theme, and how agriculture fits into that. There's sort of 2 schools of thoughts. I mean, there's one school of thought saying that what we need to do almost is intensify production on our agricultural land, almost sacrifice it, assume there's going to be a perpetual silent spring, you know, that there's going to be chemicals and pesticides, and all you get is food or fiber off that land. You'll get no environmental benefits, and instead let's protect the wild areas, and just focus on that for conservation. But there is another approach, you know, more of a landscape approach, where actually you see working lands and farming lands as actually part of holistic, sustainable, regenerative systems, which actually do have a lot of environmental benefits, which support biodiversity, which support clean water, which draw carbon down and store it on those landscapes too. And for me, that's a much more exciting vision, you know, where and it gets to a deeper philosophical point. And we don't always get to this level, but I think it's interesting for this conference that it's about what is man's relationship with nature. You know, is man outside of nature and has to somehow protect nature, but also you know, stay apart from nature, or is actually man part of nature? just as much right as a panda or a beetle, to use those resources and to be part of it. And my view is that that's a much, again, more harmonious vision. And we're all trying to get back to the Garden of Eden. But the Garden of Eden was a garden. It wasn't a wild place. It was a garden, a cultivated place. And our view is that regenerative agriculture is our best chance to get back to those kinds of landscapes which deliver these benefits, across the board. Thank you.